always had this kind of really variable climate, and Australian wetland plants are actually really good at surviving droughts. And they did a study. They looked at seed bank survival in North American wetlands versus seed bank survival in Australian wetlands. And in North America, the wetlands are either frozen during winter, or they fill up with snowmelt in spring, and sometimes they dry out over the summer. But they pretty much have a very regular filling cycle, whereas just about every winter there's a snowmelt. So at the end of every winter there's a snowmelt. So the wetlands always fill up. So the plants there have adapted to this regular. Every year we get a drink. Every year the swamp fills up, and so every year. And so they looked at swamps in North America, this particular part of the prairies in North America, and they looked at the time since they'd been drained, and they looked at the seed banks, and the longer the wetland had been drained and sort of not been wetting and drying, the less and less, and the seed bank died away very quickly. So within about 10 years, they'd lost half the seed bank in the wetland. They dried. You could dry out an Australian wetland for 10 years, wouldn't care. Next time you wet it up, everything would come. So yeah, our stuff is much more adapted to being dried out, and therefore it's actually really well adapted to, even if you've disturbed its hydrology, and then you can get the hydrology back to what it should be, you can actually get amazing like all these sedges have quite hard seeds. They'll sit there in the seed bank. You give them the right conditions, away they can go. And you can also help drown out weeds and stuff like that. So that's one critical thing, and that's what we talk about when we're looking at wetland restoration. We talk about don't fill around the edges. You've got to restore the drivers. What's the driving things that drive your wetland? And one of those drivers is the hydrology. Having that water sitting there, and for how long, and how frequently, and all that sort of stuff. The other drivers are things like the soil type and the salinity and all that sort of stuff. But the key one, if you're going to restore wetlands, is to restore the hydrology. Then you can start thinking about, okay, well, and for instance, this wetland, the hydrology might be okay. Like maybe it's still wetting as should and all that sort of stuff. So the next thing you could look at is, well, okay, it's sort of missing that herbaceous component. Can we plant back? Can we do some species enrichment planting and plant back some billy buttons? And it doesn't mean you have to plant thousands of them back, but you might plant little clusters of them, so that then they could start to cross-pollinate and direct seed, and then you can sort of start building back those populations. So what might be missing from here that we've got other sites? It might be some swamp daisies. You might want to plant. You could plant some billy buttons and some of the Swainson peas. And as long as the wetting and drying's right, then those things will start to slowly take off, and you can restore it that way. Then the other thing to put in there too is about is about fencing and grazing. So obviously part of this project involved fencing sites off, yeah. So and with the agreements, have you said no grazing at all?
No. So green grazing. Yeah, green grazing. So in summer when it's dry.
Yeah. So and we've talked a little bit about grazing. I mean, in little small groups we'd stand around chatting, but as a big group, I think it's probably worth just mentioning that wetlands aren't something you have to sort of necessarily lock up and totally have no grazing at all. And in fact, sometimes grazing can actually be a positive way to manage biomass, particularly if you've got a lot of phalaris and a lot of those sort of weeds. But it's all about how it's done, and it's about kind of timing is absolutely critical, because you don't want to cause pugging, you don't want to cause soil disturbance. So as soon as your stock start to leave pug marks, like putting dints in the ground, they should come out. And you also want to maximise the seeding of the native stuff. So you obviously don't want to be grazing in the middle of spring when all your billy buttons and often actually it works out well that the best time to graze a wetland is when all the other paddocks have dried off and you've got some nice green pick, because even after the wetland's dry and the soil might be firm enough for the stock to walk on without pugging it, there's probably still going to be some subsoil moisture down there, which a lot of these plants are really good at bringing up and actually being good feed. So it actually kind of works out from the management point of view that this is actually going to be good green pick when everything else is dried back. You can have wetlands where different parts of it are quite different. So like, for example, Stockyard Plains wetlands over near Miranda Basin, the deeper part of the wetlands is all cane grass wetland, and you wouldn't classify that as, that doesn't get called seasonal herbaceous wetland. But then the shallower parts of that wetland are very seasonal herbaceous grassy, lots of billy buttons. And so different parts of the same swamp can be in or out depending on just the hydrology of the particular areas of the swamp. So that's kind of management. I suppose the main take-home management thing is like you need to observe the wetlands. You need to and it all needs to be quite quickly reactive. And this is a problem in sort of some of the reserves that the government's purchased, particularly grassland reserves, where you know, they've taken the stock off, and then we had those wet years and all that. We had a huge amount of grass growth, and the Plains Wanderer experts were saying, excuse me, we've got to graze these paddocks right now because the Plains Wanderer's got nowhere to go because it's too thick with grass. And the inertia of government means it takes a year to get some stock onto those paddocks. Whereas if you've got a farmer who's managing it, who's already got the stock, you know, who can be reactive and who can actually say, okay, it's dried out. I mean, and it might not be, you can't sort of have a formula where you say every year in January you graze, because some years you'll have a wet January and you won't graze. And in some years you might have a really dry December or November and you might say, well, it's already dried out, you can graze earlier. So it's got to be adaptive, and it's got to be, you know, I suppose, and the main thing is having an understanding of what